Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, liebe Studierende, sehr geehrte Gäste aus der Stadt und dem Umland, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Marilena. Ich darf Sie herzlich begrüßen zur dritten Veranstaltung der Ruperto Carola Ringvorlesung Immaterielles Erbe, eine Zukunftsressource? Fragezeichen. Damit würdigt die Universität Heidelberg das 20-jährige Bestehen der UNESCO-Konvention zum Erhalt des immateriellen Erbes. Mein Name ist Thomas Schmidt, ich lehre Cultural Heritage und Kulturgüterschutz an der Universität und werde den Abend moderieren. Lassen Sie mich gleich zu Beginn ein Versäumnis korrigieren. Ich hatte vor 2 Wochen mehreren Personen gedankt, die bei der Vorbereitung und Durchführung der Ringvorlesung maßgeblich beteiligt waren und sind und dabei zwar nicht im Manuskript, aber doch im mündlichen Vortrag ausgerechnet Frau Monika Konrad aus dem Rektorat der Universität unterschlagen. Dies sei hiermit korrigiert, verbunden mit einem herzlichen Dank an Frau Konrad für die Co-Organisation hinter den Kulissen. Wir haben heute Abend einen Vortrag in englischer Sprache. Dies ist im akademischen Kontext selbstverständlich nichts Ungewöhnliches, vielleicht aber schon bei einem Format wie der Ruperto Carola Ringvorlesung, welche sich als zentrale Veranstaltung nicht nur an Fachkolleginnen und Kollegen und Studierende, sondern auch an die breite Öffentlichkeit richten möchte. Ich hoffe, Sie können nachvollziehen, dass wir bei einem solch global diskutierten Thema auch Expertise aus dem Ausland einbinden und auch mit Ihnen dieses Thema diskutieren wollen. Ich möchte mir jedoch, wie Sie bereits merken, im Kontext dieser Ringvorlesung erlauben, auch in Absprache mit der Referentin, diese kurze Einführung in deutscher Sprache zu halten und Ihnen dabei auch über die Vorstellung der Referentin hinaus noch in aller gebotenen Kürze einige Kontextinformationen mitzuliefern, die Sie dann schon kennen, falls Sie bei den ersten beiden Vorträgen dabei waren. Wie wir in den bisherigen Beiträgen gesehen haben, will die UNESCO mit der Konvention von 2003 immaterielle Praktiken, also zum Beispiel Bräuche, performative Künste, überlieferte Handwerkskunst, aber auch zum Beispiel Weltwissen etwa indigener Gruppen erhalten helfen. In der Folie sehen Sie wiederholend zu dem ersten Vortrag die Definition vom immateriellen Kulturerbe, eben im Englischen nicht mit immaterial gefasst, sondern mit dem Wort intangible cultural heritage, also wörtlich ins Deutsche übertragen unberührtes Kulturerbe. Und wir müssen in der kulturwissenschaftlichen Diskussion und selbstverständlich bei einem internationalen Vortrag wie heute beide Sprachgebräuche und Praktiken eben mit im Blick haben. Die Angabe der international maßgeblichen englischen Fassung und der deutschen Übersetzung im Vorfeld des Vortrags mag Ihnen für den folgenden Vortrag eine kleine Unterstützung sein. Dies gilt auch für die zweite Folie, und zwar für die zweisprachige Angabe konkreterer Bereiche, in denen sich die UNESCO-Konvention zuständig sieht. Hier also die deutsche Übersetzung und hier die international maßgeblichere englische Fassung. Als Negativfolie gegenüber dem lebendigen Erhalt von Praktiken wird in der Fachdiskussion gelegentlich das Bild der Musealisierung, englisch Musealization, benutzt. Das Museum erscheint, überspitzt formuliert, als eine Art Todesfalle, in welcher die einst lebendigen Traditionen ihrer Lebendigkeit beraubt und entkontextualisiert dargestellt werden. Nun finden sich andererseits in vielen Museen Darstellungen und Informationen zu immateriellen Traditionen bzw. Praktiken oder entsprechende Artefakte wie Musikinstrumente oder Werkzeuge werden darin ausgestellt. Wir sehen also, das Verhältnis von Museen zu immateriellen Praktiken ist von einem Spannungsverhältnis gekennzeichnet und es ist genau dieses, welches die Referentin des heutigen Abends beleuchten wird, also diese Tension zwischen Erhalt immaterieller Traditionen und ihrer Repräsentation Darstellung im Museum, ist das überhaupt eine angemessene Formulierung? Also wie kann ein solches Ausstellen angemessen, adäquat im 21. Jahrhundert erfolgen? Ich darf Ihnen zum Abschluss meiner kurzen Einführung die Referentin kurz vorstellen. Marilena Alivizatou stammt aus Griechenland. Sie hat zunächst von 1999 bis 2003 an der Nationalen Universität Athen einen Bachelorabschluss in Theaterwissenschaften absolviert. Anschließend machte sie einen Abschluss in Cultural Heritage and Museum Studies am University College London. Und in diesem Themengebiet hat sie von 2005 bis 2009 auch dort für ihre Promotion gearbeitet. Diese Promotion ist dann auch Hintergrund ihrer ersten Monographie, die 2012 erschienen ist, eben genau zu dem Thema unseres Abends, Intangible Heritage and the Museum, New Perspectives on Cultural Preservation. Und für diese Arbeit hat sie Museen auf mehreren Kontinenten bereist, analysiert und interpretiert, also Feldforschung durchgeführt und anschließend ihre Ergebnisse etwa durch die Ausstellungsbesuche und durch die Gespräche mit zahlreichen Akteurinnen und Akteuren verglichen. Ihr heutiger Vortrag wird gerade auch aus diesem Material schöpfen, aber zu einem gewissen Teil auch aus der zweiten Monographie. Sie hat sich weiter mit dem Thema immaterielles Erbe beschäftigt und eben vor 2 Jahren, 2021, eine weitere Monographie vorgelegt zum Thema Intangible Heritage and Participation, also immaterielles Erbe und Beteiligung, Partizipation. Sie ist derzeit Honorary Lecturer am University College London und wir freuen uns sehr, dass sie den Weg heute hier zu uns nach Heidelberg gefunden hat. Dear Marilena, we are looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Thomas. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here today. So let me start. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the UNESCO Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Heritage, which was also the beginning of my own research journey in the realms of the intangible as a graduate student in Cultural Heritage and Museum Studies at UCL. Today, I would like to share with you some findings from this journey. For the past 2 decades, my work has looked at how museums engage with intangible heritage, not only in order to support its safeguarding, but also in terms of creating new opportunities for inclusive and equitable practices. This question raises conceptual and practical challenges, which will be the topic of today's presentation. But it is also a question that can be problematic, both from the perspective of intangible heritage and the perspective of museums, which I think is more or less what Thomas said in his introduction. So let us start with intangible heritage. A significant body of research has examined the making of intangible heritage within the framework of global governance, in what Barbara Kirscheblatt-Gimblet describes as the interface of economic development theories and national ideologies of cultural uniqueness, and what Rosemary Coombe also calls the interpenetration of civil society, state, and market forces. The making of intangible heritage and the 2003 Convention has also been situated within an international paradigm of living heritage emerging from Asia and the global South, which often counteracts Western values of materiality and authenticity. Clearly, and as Thomas has also described in his paper on the Jemaa el-Fna Square in Marrakesh, the processes and ideas that led to the birth of intangible heritage are complex, sometimes controversial, and often inconclusive. As a researcher, I'm interested in intangible heritage as a tool of governance within the networks of UNESCO, but I'm equally interested in what intangible heritage actually means conceptually and practically beyond the UNESCO definitions. In other words, how it informs our thinking about cultural heritage and also gives shape to present-day heritage, community, and museum work. Drawing on the 2003 Convention and its critical conversations, I use intangible heritage as a term that refers to collective knowledges, experiences, and practices that are of value to living people and transmitted orally and or performatively through the generations. In that sense, I'm in agreement with Harriet Deacon and Rick Smeets, who wrote a paper describing that the 2003 Convention is innovative when compared to the other UNESCO Heritage Conventions, and most notably the 1972 World Heritage Convention. A first point setting the 2003 Convention apart is its dynamic and embodied approach to cultural heritage. Unlike the World Heritage Convention that focuses primarily on the material conservation of historic monuments and sites of outstanding universal value, the 2003 Convention provides a human-centered approach and acknowledges that intangible heritage is living and constantly recreated by its practitioners. A second innovation of the Convention is that it stresses the importance of including communities, groups, and individuals that create, maintain, and transmit cultural practices in safeguarding activities. Unlike objects and archaeological sites, which are typically looked after by trained professionals like museum curators, conservators, the safeguarding of intangible heritage is the responsibility of communities and groups of cultural practitioners. However, these two innovations of intangible heritage could be problematic when it comes to museums. Let's see why. The dictum of German philosopher Theodor Adorno encapsulates well the idea of the museum as a place for keeping dead objects. In his famous essay, The Valerie Proust Museum, he writes, the German word museo has unpleasant undertones. It describes objects to which the observer no longer has a vital relationship and which are in the process of dying. They owe their preservation more to historical respect than to the needs of the present. Museum and mausoleum are connected with more than phonetic association. Similarly, in English, the colloquial expression of something belonging in a museum tends to refer to objects that should be preserved for posterity, either as precious collections of art and antiquities or as remnants of past traditions no longer in use, like disused industrial or agricultural equipment. The association of museums with dead objects disconnected from living people lies in stark contrast to the idea of the ancient Greek museion, a place of worship of the 9 muses, the inspirational goddesses of the arts and sciences, including epic poetry and astronomy. As opposed to funerary associations that we saw before, the Greek museion conjures images of life and creativity rather than morbid preservation. But beyond the idea of the mausoleum, museums have been associated with social inequality and elitism. In their famous study of museums in Europe in the 1980s, French researchers Bourdieu and Arbel noted how museums often reproduce dominant social structures at the expense of social and ethnic minorities, by reinforcing in some people the feeling of belonging and in others the feeling of exclusion. The reproduction of such structures relates not only to social inequalities in audiences, but also to inequalities between experts that have the knowledge and power to look after and interpret what is in the museum, and non-experts. So, to summarize, on the one hand is the idea of intangible heritage as living knowledges and practices constantly recreated by its communities, and on the other is the mausoleum of dead objects curated by an elite of experts. So despite this obvious conflict or incongruence, the two ideas are more closely related than we might initially assume. Why? This is because both are motivated by loss aversion, where conservation, preservation, and safeguarding measures are taken in order to ensure that heritage in the form of artworks, antiquities, but also songs, languages, and skills, and among others, is not lost. Both museums and intangible heritage are driven by the fear of loss, a sense of endangerment from a wide range of threats, such as biophysical risks like pests, humidity, or earthquakes, or social risks like political instability, historical transformations, and globalization. In fact, museums and intangible heritage are affiliated not only existentially, but also in terms of their operational framework, the tools of their craft. As Kirschenblatt-Gimblet argues, intangible heritage is created through operations that extend museological values and methods, such as collection, documentation, and interpretation, to living persons, their knowledge, practices, artifacts, social words, and life spaces. While this raises concerns about mainstream museum processes turning people's lifeways into fixed exhibits of cultures, the application of a museological framework on intangible heritage, as discussed earlier with the two innovations, ultimately invites the active involvement on communities of cultural practitioners in basic museum functions. So actually, this is an opportunity to reimagine Adorno's mausoleum of dead or dying objects as the creative and animated space temple of the muses. In my research, I examined the processes, opportunities, and challenges for community-based participatory work to inform and reshape basic museum functions and intangible heritage actions. At the center of this examination is the dynamic interaction between the two ideas of the mausoleum and the Temple of the Muses, which are also framed by the competing tendencies between loss aversion and creativity, between preservation and transformation, and between continuity and innovation. I will now present some case studies of museum and community initiatives that I have researched to better illustrate the above. An important area of museum work and intangible heritage safeguarding is collecting. Collections, documentation, and research are at the center of museums, and also the 2003 Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Heritage invites member states to create inventories, so to collect, to identify and collect intangible heritage. How can intangible heritage be collected? Who should collect it? To what end? These are questions that the best minds in collections management and museum documentation are still grappling with, and will be discussing next week at the ICOM CDOC Intangible Heritage Working Group virtual meeting, which is open to everyone to join, and the link is over there. In my latest book, though, I start by looking at the Museum of Popular Arts and Traditions in Paris, the brainchild of the father of French museology, Georges-Henri Rivière, as an example of an early museum research and documentation on intangible heritage of French rural and peasant cultures. The collection started in 1937, was displayed in a purpose-built museum in 1973, that was permanently shut in 2005. What is interesting about this collection is that it was created as a museum laboratory to facilitate research and documentation on disappearing folk cultural traditions and practices. This was achieved by applying the latest scientific methods and tools such as field research, mapping, interviewing, audiovisual documentation, and object collection by a range of social scientists, ethnologists, architects, and artists. While most of the research took place behind the scenes in the museum lab, the displays aimed at presenting the research to the public. However, due to lack of public interest and funding, the museum in Paris ended up as a mausoleum of French folk culture, and the research laboratory eventually moved to the university. So where the museum stood, today stands the new Fondation Louis Vuitton in the Bois de Boulogne. Although the original museum was permanently shut, the original collection is now used to tell a different story of France as part of Europe and the Mediterranean in the Muséum in Marseille. But the case of the Museum of Popular Arts and Cultures could be regarded as an example of ethnographic documentation of the wider socio-cultural context of French rural and folk culture or intangible heritage, a research project that extends beyond the collection of objects to a holistic framework of research and archival documentation. So, despite the failure, it should be noted that it was Rivière and his colleague that came up with the idea of the eco-museums, which of course was a more successful concept connecting people, places, and objects, and has been applied around the world. But similar ideas about researching the context of collections, the socio-cultural context of collections, exist today, when intangible heritage is related to the contextualization of objects, for example, through film or ethnographic documentaries in multimedia galleries and new media displays, like the case of the Quai Branly Museum. Researching the context of objects could be a way for engaging with the documentation of intangible heritage. Yet, communities of cultural practitioners remain primarily sources of information rather than actively engaged in the research and collecting process. So the question that is raised is how can museums engage with intangible heritage through the active and meaningful participation of communities, which after all is its key characteristic. To further address this question, I will now turn to a community-oriented collecting project at Museum Rotterdam in the Netherlands, called Authentic Rotterdam Heritage, which took place between 2016 and 2020. The project began as a contemporary collecting project in order to reflect the changing identities of the city's inhabitants, but soon moved from the idea of a physical object collection to an active and dynamic one. Nicole van Dijk, an anthropologist and museum curator, talked to me in 2019 about her work in setting up this project, and noted that we tried to be less focused on the end results and more with how heritage and working with heritage was helping communities and connecting people. So community engagement became a main focus for collecting. A Heritage Council was set up in 2017 to broaden the input of Rotterdammers in identifying what the collection should look like going forward. The Heritage Council was made up of 12 volunteers who decided on the social initiatives or people to be added to the active collection. They agreed on a set of criteria of what should be included, among others that it is from Rotterdam or in Rotterdam, that it adds something to the city, that it is actively working for others, and that it is related to a historical development or an object from the museum. This last criterion served as a connecting link between the active collection and the historic collection of the museum. The first item in the collection focused on the city's diversity and the influx of new communities. The van of a migrant worker from Bulgaria called Kamen Vladimirov became the first item in the collection while still being used to transport goods between Rotterdam and the town of Montana in Bulgaria. As Kamen did not have resident status, he was obliged to leave the country every 3 months. The van became a symbol of travel across Europe, and we were able to follow its story and the story of Kamen, said Nicole. Kamen's story and the statue are part of a new exhibition about Rotterdammers in the new museum. Other items followed in the active collection, like the West Kruisgate Alliance, which was the number 11, a group of residents, local authorities and shop owners in the rundown area situated next to the main train station. Within 6 years of its formation, the Alliance worked for the regeneration of the area while trying to preserve its ethnic diversity. As more inner cities in the Netherlands start to look alike, West Kruisgate shows Rotterdam's diversity in a microcosm, explains its entry to the active collection catalogue, further noting how the first impression is a Chinatown dotted in between our many Surinamese stores with their Indian, Indonesian, Chinese, and Arabic backgrounds. Through the work of the Heritage Council, a shift has taken place over the last year in what becomes part of the active collection. Documenting the city's diversity seems to have given way to a focus on social initiatives that make the city a better place to live in. For Nicole, this is where the word heritage comes into place. People are a bit confused when they hear about this project being about heritage. Heritage is usually something iconic, big monuments in the city, but we are trying to make visible the forces underneath that, which make the city work as it does and make the city better, she said. So authentic Rotterdam heritage has brought into the spotlight the people of the city, its communities, as active collection and collectors at the same time. On the one hand, this is a process of democratizing decisions about what is part of a museum collection. The Heritage Council, rather than the collection specialist, becomes a tool for the empowerment of the citizens who choose how they want to collect their city and its creative forces. On the other hand, the collecting spotlight is on people and social actions that make the city a better place. That means tackling important issues from social integration to life insurance for the self-employed and from climate change to urban development, and the project creates heritage for the future then as a feeling of responsibility of citizens towards the city and its inhabitants. However, this inspiring project does not sit comfortably with the expectations of what a city museum is, and has met with significant levels of resistance from within the museum establishment. Recently, Nicole confirmed that the active collection would find a more suitable home in the city archives rather than a museum. So the conclusion here is that participatory work remains a controversial area for bigger historic institutions like many museums, which are used to doing things in a certain way. I will now move to a second case study which involves a new museum, so they were able to do things differently. The second case of participatory work I would like to discuss is the place of memory and social inclusion, El Lugar de la Memoria, Tolerancia e Inclusión Social, in short, LUM, in Lima, Peru. This is a new museum which opened in 2015 and is purposely not called a museum. This is so for different reasons, one of which is the generally accepted view of museums as mausoleums for the display of collections of objects from the past. Although a space of commemorating the civil conflict in Peru, LUM is about learning from the past and acting for a better present. So here I look at intangible heritage from the perspective of memory work and oral history. While the notion of intangible heritage is firmly embedded within the work of UNESCO, I built on the idea of difficult intangible heritage to examine participatory museum work as a response to difficult or traumatic events and situations. Experiences and memories of political violence, illness, or forced migration do not fall within the formal domains of intangible heritage and would not be part of a national inventory. Yet they constitute part of people's identity and lived or inherited knowledges passed from one generation to the next. One such case of difficult intangible heritage is the civil conflict in Peru. The decades between 1980 and 2000, Peru witnessed a period of political violence, also known as Years of Terror, between supporters of the Maoist organization Sendero Luminoso and Movimiento Revolucionario Tupac Amaru and the Peruvian state. The conflict took place in different parts of the country, predominantly rural. According to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, It is estimated that 69,000 people were assassinated, 2/3 of which belonged to Quechua-speaking Andean communities and indigenous communities in the Amazonian forest. Against the backdrop of a largely urban public indifference in the capital, Lima, a discourse of memory took shape slowly and through constant negotiation between the parties involved, including the government, families of victims, researchers, journalists, artists, and the army. Beyond permanent exhibitions telling the story of the conflict, Loom includes spaces for temporary exhibitions on themes related to memory, social inclusion, and tolerance, a center for documentation and research which houses the testimonies collected by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, outdoor and indoor areas for public events. A process of participation and dialogue on the content and museological script between a core team driving the project and a group of often opposing parties gradually developed at the heart of Loom. The main parties included the government, victims' associations, human rights NGOs, army and police representatives, artists, researchers, and syndicates. Existing conflicts and tensions between those groups, for example, state organizations and human rights NGOs, intensified the participatory process. Drawing on findings from this participatory process, museum curators built on Zvedan Todorov's idea of exemplary memory to argue for the need for the new space to be primarily a pedagogical institution. Although the ideas of memory as a moral duty and a way for atrocities to not happen again are powerful messages for the memorialization of political violence, they argue for the additional need to activate a discourse on human and citizen rights and dignity in the present. In Loom, memory is an instrument for critical reflection on the present. This is realized through the process of active remembering that unfolds concurrently along the narrative of the exhibits in the work of the Research and Documentation Center and the public events taking place at Loom. What became evident from the participatory process was a diversity of memories and experiences of violence. This meant that the collective memory of the conflict was made up of a plurality of memories, individual, powerful, and equally valid. It was the responsibility of Loom to maintain and safeguard those memories in order to question, explore, and understand the past and how those stories inform the present and future of the country. For this reason, it was proposed that the plurality of the human experience of the conflict should be at the center of Loom through individual, often self-told stories and testimonies. Throughout the permanent exhibition, testimonies are presented next to displays of objects, photographs, and texts, providing an additional layer of information in each section. It is further into the exhibition in the space entitled Una persona, todas las personas, one person, all persons, where life histories become the center of the museum narrative. This space is dedicated to the testimonies of 18 men and women presented in human-sized flat screens spread around the room and suspending from the ceiling. Each flat screen, which is connected to a set of headphones, shows a 10-minute extract from longer interviews filmed in a studio for the exhibition. Every speaker is presented standing up against a black backdrop and looking directly into the camera. There is a feeling of intimate conversation between the speaker and the viewer. The 18 individuals interviewed belong to the civil groups that took part in the participatory process. For the curators, each testimony challenges the dualistic categories of victims and perpetrators. Through the telling of their stories, these 18 individuals reveal how painfully the conflict was experienced across the country and question stereotypical representations of powerless victims. In so doing, they become empowered subjects actively seeking respect and justice. The curators wrote about the need to appeal to alternate modes of memory. This included the recording of chants and songs shouted during demonstrations, but also banners and embroidered textiles made collectively by women and displayed publicly in protests and marches. An emotionally charged part of the displays is the Chalinas de la Esperanza, the scarves of hope, a scarf that is 1 kilometer long and is made out of smaller scarves that have been stitched together. The scarf was made by women, mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters of people that disappeared. Each scarf has the name of a missing loved one and a message of love and hope. In 2010, when the first pieces of the scarf were put together, it was estimated that about 15,000 people were missing following the events of the conflict. Organized by families of missing people and the International Commission of the Red Cross, the Chalina de la Esperanza became a symbol of love for lost relatives and action against state indifference. Knitting, stitching, weaving, and embroidery is a craft, a form of intangible heritage that is part of women's rural and small-town life in the Andes. The scarf of hope became a symbol of resistance, but also a symbol of active remembering of the difficult, intangible heritage of the Civil War. So, Lume is a government project, a shared space for remembering that is energized through the active participation of affected peoples in telling their stories and giving shape to a shared history. The years of political violence are part of the country's heritage, a difficult, intangible heritage, the memories and embodied experience of which are passed on, among others, through participatory processes of testimony and communal art. Here, people that were directly affected by violence built a complex, inconclusive, and ongoing story of conflict and loss by making a strong call for justice and equal rights for all. A museum that could have been a mausoleum of the victims of the conflict has instead emerged as a living space for community participation and active remembering. So both of this museum, Museum Rotterdam and the Lugar de la Memoria, are two museums that have challenged the museal comfort zone of researching and presenting objects, and instead have encouraged the participation of living communities to make new collections and tell their own stories. This has created new ways for public engagement where communities are shaping the museum narrative and are not just sources of information or recipients of an authorized museum message. In my two books, I discuss many other examples of museums that have engaged with intangible heritage in ways that challenge and often reinvent their roles in society. Due to time limitations, unfortunately, I cannot discuss them all, but in brief, this includes, for example, community field workers researching traditional cultural practices in the Pacific island nation of Vanuatu, a remarkable project and one of the innovators of participatory community research, which was set up in the 1970s. The fieldwork volunteers have played an important role not only in documenting cultural knowledges and traditions, but also in disseminating them in the younger generations. These are all examples from my first book, which focused a lot on indigenous knowledge, which was also the main research focus in the inclusion of traditional knowledge in terms of looking after and curating the collections at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington. Here, also community curators used the traditional knowledge to interpret the displays. Another example that I'm sharing as a way of showing the breadth of the work that can take place in terms of challenging the museal comfort zone is the creation of a house of memory in Aarhus, Denmark. When I visited in 2019 and spoke with the curators and the people running the House of Memory, they explained that it was through the use of songs, music, food, and perfumes from the past, how they are used to revive memories in people with dementia. So it's a space in the museum which is actually used for for looking after people that have serious illnesses. The list goes on. But what is the common denominator in all of those cases, some of which are successful, some of which less so, is the effort on the part of museums to be open, inclusive, and inspiring places, working with people from different walks of life to pass on stories, practices, and knowledges from the past and make a better and fairer present and future. Therefore, the inclusion of living heritage invites museums to set up processes of working with relevant, interested, and engaged communities, groups, and individuals to identify shared knowledges, experiences, and practices from the past that are valuable in the present. This participatory process can help us rethink what museums do, how they do it, and for whom they do it. But this is also an opportunity to reconsider intangible heritage as a universalizing discourse within the UNESCO apparatus. As museums are invited to find their own ways for engaging with intangible heritage, so should global players like UNESCO and its networks be mindful of not creating and imposing a moral framework of safeguarding that can often be unhelpful and inappropriate. So, before I finish my presentation, I would like to also share some thoughts about the main theme of the lecture series, if intangible heritage can be a resource for the future. Well, judging by the number of cultural expressions on the UNESCO representative list and the amount of research papers, conferences, and publications, it could be argued that the first 2 decades of the convention have been a success and that intangible heritage has been a useful resource for different actors and different reasons at global, national, and local levels. In that same period, the Convention Committee and Secretariat have also listened to concerns and critiques and adapted the discourse of the Convention. So an important change in that respect is that the term living heritage is increasingly used instead of intangible heritage to underline a lighter approach to safeguarding and a more flexible understanding of the term. This is also coupled with a shift away from a safeguarding anxiety towards the sustainable development goals of social equality, economic growth, and environmental sustainability. These recent developments suggest that intangible heritage is increasingly seen not as dying traditions that need to be saved, but as a useful resource for a fairer, better, sustainable future. And I would argue also a fertile ground for new research in cultural heritage studies. Thank you very much.